Welcome and aloha. I'm Mark Shklov, the host of ThinkTech Hawaii's Law Across the Sea program. Today we are going across the sea to discuss what's happening in Israel and Gaza. My guest today is Peter Hoffenberg. Peter is a professor of history at the University of Hawaii and frequently appears with Jay Fidel on ThinkTech Hawaii's History is Here to Help program. I've asked Peter to help me understand current events in Israel and Gaza and their historical context, and to share his professorial perspective on all of them. Welcome, Peter. It's good to see you.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you and see you. Thank you.
Well, first, I am learning. I'm a student. And let's discuss how these most recent events got started. We all know about there's violence going on between Israel, Palestinians, and Israel, and shooting, and Gaza shooting from Hamas. I've heard that it started, and I'd like to find out how it started, but I've heard that the Palestinians were being evicted from their homes in Israel, which they had rented from Israelis, being evicted because they didn't pay the rent, but the Palestinians felt they were being treated unfairly, that the matter was being litigated in Israel, but that is what prompted Hamas to fire the missiles from Gaza into Israel. Now, I don't know, that's what I've heard on media. I just trying to find out, what have you heard?
Of course.
Is that accurate? Or what is the dispute about? Can you tell me?
Right.
Can you share?
I will do the best I can. Let me confess, I'm a student as well. So I appreciate your introduction that we're trying to learn and we're having a discussion. So I think if folks, now it's 14, 15 days ago, when they opened up the newspaper or heard on the radio that there was explicit fighting, folks asked what precipitated it. And so I think most people agree. Now, this is not taking one side or the other, right? We're trying to figure out what happened. Most people agree, in part, it was precisely what you said, that there had been another of a series of evictions in Jerusalem. I don't know precisely whether it was because they could not pay rent or not, but I do know, and everybody admits, that there's been a long series of evictions. So that's certainly part of it. Why Hamas particularly got involved, though, I think most people agree it was because of what happened at the sacred mosque in Jerusalem during Ramadan. And during Ramadan, there was going to be an Israeli political rally in the near proximity of where the Ramadan celebrations and honoring. Ramadan is not really a celebration, it's a holy event. So let's be more precise, honoring and worshiping. And I think we agree a heavy-handed way, and I'm sure the Israelis regret this. Israeli police went in to the site, which was supposed to be reserved and governed by the Palestinians and the Muslims, and dispersed the crowd. But what you have just immediately, and I'm sure all of your viewers and listeners have some sort of gut reaction to Jerusalem, right? Is that this city, the holiest spot for three monotheistic religions, was erupted. So Hamas, most people say, figured, all right, and this is not to blame Hamas or not, but figured that Jerusalem, and being the flag waver, not just for Palestinians, but for the Islamicist movement, required them to respond. Now, there are a whole series of other issues, which again, your readers have probably read about, but we historians always ask why, when, where. So here, the original focal point, the lighting point seems to be Jerusalem. But remember, Jerusalem and Gaza, we live in Hawaii, so we can appreciate this. Everything's close, right? If you live in Montana and you tell somebody there's Gaza and Jerusalem, that really makes no sense, right? They're used to thousands of miles. But I think if you live in Hawaii, you can get a sense that, if something happens in Waianae and you live downtown, you can almost see, right? You can see what's going on. So I know it sounds banal, but the proximity is important. So the short answer is Jerusalem erupted. And Hamas, seeing a political opportunity, in part because there are no Palestinian elections, launched an attack on Israel. I don't think people disagree with the launching of the attack. They sent thousands of missiles. People have concerns and disagreements about, how the Israelis handled the Mount rally. I mean, looking back, I think if we're all honest, they should have figured out some way to coexist. Now, the Israelis say that there were terrorist activists at services on the Mount during Ramadan. I think that's probably true. The question is, though, how do you respond to that, right? I mean, do you try to go in, identify, and arrest those people? Do you maybe just cordon off the area? But the idea of going in and pulling cords from loudspeakers, beating up people, hundreds were injured. I think looking back, we're going to see that. Now, having said that, and I'm sorry for being long-winded, both sides were ready for war. Let's not mistake ourselves, right? That even though there's a ceasefire right now, the Israelis have strategic reasons to want to attack Hamas in Gaza, and Hamas always has reasons to want to attack Israel. So it just kind of takes a spark, right? And Jerusalem, in this case, Jerusalem was the spark. I think more than even Gaza. I mean, Gaza was the tinder, and Gaza blew up. But I think most people agree that the explosion was Jerusalem.
And you're saying that Hamas had a political objective by doing this, and I appreciate you're trying not to take sides, but to present an even picture of what's happening from the basis on what you've seen and heard. What is Hamas's political objective?
So Hamas's political objective, I think, and Americans again can kind of foresee part of this and not quite understand the other part. The first part is, as Tip O'Neill said, all politics are local. There is a political vacuum in the Palestinian leadership that was increased when the PLA decided to cancel elections. So what we have locally is Hamas trying to assert itself as the key dominant political representative for some group, and I don't mean that in a snarky way because it is a diverse community, some group we call the Palestinians. And I'm not a snarky, not illegitimate way, but let's remember there are Palestinian Christians, right? Not all Palestinians are Muslims. There are Palestinian professionals. Not all of them are manual laborers. There are Palestinians who live in Israel proper, but they don't have a political umbrella. So one of the objectives is Hamas being the dominant political player for the Palestinian people. And that includes when they took over Gaza, sometimes murdering al-Fatah opponents, and it means a constant tension with the PLA. The second objective is, I think, probably more of the existentialist one, which is Hamas alongside Iran and Hezbollah embracing a political objective of a Jewish-free Middle East. That's always a possibility. It's in their charter. I don't think anybody should ignore that. Hamas is a terrorist group. Now, whether or not we should negotiate with terrorists, that's a different issue. But it is a terrorist group. And certainly among its goals written down in the charter is to have the famous saying or infamous saying, from the Red Sea to the Galilee, or the Galilee to the Red Sea, there will be no Jews. Now that brings in Iran. It brings in Hezbollah. It brings in some Palestinians. I wouldn't say all. It would be completely inaccurate to paint all Palestinians as being anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. But it certainly is a rallying cry for some Palestinians and some who are sympathetic.
Well, this makes me think about the two-state solution that we've heard about in the past. what I'm hearing from you is historically Hamas was, I guess, is not in favor of the two-state solution. Although I've also heard that maybe that Israel is not in favor of it. I mean, what is the two-state
Okay,
solution?
so it's
Has
a
it
really
evolved
important
anything?
question. Okay, ever since in this way, I think a lot of your viewers will appreciate this. That there was an Ottoman Empire over this area, and then there was a British mandate over this area. That should begin to sound familiar, like the British 13 colonies.
Right.
And then the British left, as the European foreign powers left many places. Most of the places that the British left, there was a partition. Ireland, Cyprus, most of Africa. Americans don't like that word partition. You could think of the American Civil War. We don't like it. But most of the world is partition. So the idea of having a partition two-state solution is over 100 years old. Now, that though begs the question, right? Where's the partition line going to be? And will both states be viable? Viable economically, but also will the neighboring state be a military threat? So the short answer is this has been on the table for over 100 years. The complicated answer is it's been a dance. That sometimes in the Oslo Accords, the Israelis have offered what they think of as a two-state solution. And some people say, you're right. The other side has generally two responses. One response is driven by, we really don't want a two-state solution. We want the Jews out of here. But the other is a more nuanced one, which is, are you partitioning the area in a way which we will be viable? Right? So is there going to be enough land in Palestine? Will it not be landlocked? I mean, all the things you can think of. Again, in Hawaii, I think we're more attuned to this. Like imagine Hawaii without an airport, right? So imagine Gaza or the Palestinian state without an airport, right? We probably don't understand this because we're surrounded by water, but imagine a state that didn't have access to the sea. Right, so these are really very practical matters. So a lot of the debate has been, okay, we'll take two states, but for the Palestinians, right, is it viable? For the Israelis, are you not going to attack us? Right, so we have to have a viability of two states and the promise, to have, obviously there are going to be soldiers on the border and there'll be fences. We know that. Everybody has fences everywhere. But are you looking across the fence thinking that an attack is going to happen? Or are you looking all over the fence and saying, all right, well, maybe this person here or there is going to do something? So it is increasingly, though, I would say, a less viable opportunity. And that ties into what you started with, which is evictions in Jerusalem. The Palestinian movement has claimed, not surprisingly and not without reason, that East Jerusalem will be the capital of the Palestinian state. All right. Now, if East Jerusalem is going to be the capital of the Palestinian state, and we see recurring evictions of Palestinians and replacing them with non-Palestinians, or Netanyahu continues to build in areas which would be a Palestinian state, you can see the opportunity beginning to slip.
Right. And what I hear you saying also is that these people are just not looking at the same view. They may have the same language, I mean, two-state solution, but they still do not define it the same. And they can't come to an agreement on it, is what I hear.
Well, I think what they can't come to agreement on is really practical. Where's the border going to be? Very practical. I mean, the assumption would be that if there were a two-state solution, what remained of Israel will be a Jewish state and Jewish society in which Palestinians and Arabs can live. And presumably, the other would be a Palestinian state where presumably Jews could live, but it would be a Palestinian state. So one of the solutions is, okay, draw the line. And those Jews, sometimes from outside of Israel, who have moved into the West Bank and other areas, say, okay, you know what? You're now on the Palestinian side. You are a Palestinian citizen. You're not an Israeli citizen. All right, but nobody's going to take that political step. That would be political suicide in Israel. But there's a possibility. Remember, in Gaza, with Gaza, the Israeli troops and policemen had to force Jewish settlers to leave, and Jewish settlers left. All right, and that was going to be a Palestinian community.
Well, let's talk about. I want to come back now. We're talking about currently there's a ceasefire in Israel and Gaza, and I've heard that there are people in both Israel and Gaza that want to live in peace and harmony with each other, but then there's others that,
Sure.
and I hear that want to destroy each other. And so, can you tell me what the current atmosphere is like in those places, and how long will the ceasefire last? Will it last? And is there a historical precedent for what's happening now with the ceasefire?
Okay, all good questions. All probably take their own show. So let me just begin to. It's not because in a way you've really hit the nail on the head. A majority of people living in that area would like, just like the most of us, just get along with our lives. A majority. Some, though, clearly have more extreme positions. And then there is a group who have grievances, right? They would like to lead a normal life, but they're not able to. All right. So in that mix, what do we say about, first of all, the ceasefire? Okay. As I've discussed with other people, it seems to me that the ceasefire is going to depend on outside powers enforcing it. So those who support Israel are going to have to enforce the ceasefire by putting pressure on Israel. And a country like Iran clearly supports Hezbollah and Hamas is going to have to also turn off the spigots. Otherwise, we just have a timeout. And Hamas will replenish its missiles. It will rebuild its tunnels. Netanyahu will stay in power and continually talk about the Iranian threat. So I am not overly hopeful unless either international powers get involved, like the United Nations, on an even-handed basis. And that includes the US. The US has to support Israel, but also pressure Israel for peace. Or, as a dear friend of mine said, everybody should just get their fingers out of the pie and just let the Israelis and the Palestinians go. So Iranians, don't do anything, don't supply. US, get out of there. Okay, now, will it last? I think there's enough pressure right now for it to last for at least a while. The real question, though, is whether the governments are going to use that time to rearm, right? That's really the question. Now, your fascinating and very important question, among all of them are important, but the one that at least hits most home with me is, what about the people who just want to live in peace? Right? What do we do to empower them? And I would say that right now, there are many Arabs, Druze, Jews, Israelis who meet, who rally, who are creating schools, which are all at a level of common people building the kind of networks that are necessary to promote peace. There are precedents. There are precedents which are shaky. There's a precedent of Northern Ireland, where it's relative, until Brexit, Northern Ireland was relatively peaceful for 25 years. It took a lot of hard work, but it also included a lot of community and it also included the US the US had to cease its support of the IRA. The US politically and monetarily was a major funder of the IRA. At the same time, the US had to put pressure on the English government to treat the Irish better. Okay. Cyprus is relatively peaceful. That's a case of partition and some interaction. So, there are precedents, and all of those have old enmities. And the argument that somehow Jews and Palestinians and Arabs have hated each other for 1,000 years, I don't, as a historian, I don't put much stock in that. The only stock in is I see people using it as an excuse to still hate. But there have been plenty of times where, if not Jews, Christians, and Arabs have loved each other, they've been able to coexist without coercion.
Well, that's something that we don't hear much about.
No, you don't.
I mean, I wasn't aware that there are people that are trying to work together for that end. Now, one thing I noticed, and I don't quite understand, why is Egypt the mediator in this dispute? I mean, have they had a historical role between
Right.
Israel and Palestine?
So,
I didn't quite catch
again,
what that was about.
you're asking all the really, really good, hard, and important questions. I think Egypt has a role for a couple of reasons. One is, since Hamas is a terrorist organization, no official United States diplomat can speak directly to them. So Egypt can be an intermediary, right? We give Egypt a tremendous amount of aid, mostly military. We can put a little bit of diplomatic pressure on Egypt and say, here's what we want you to tell Hamas. Okay. Secondly, when people look at the map, they often forget, and there's no reason they would, remember, but the other neighbor of Gaza is Egypt.
Uh-huh.
So, Israel used to have the Sinai, gave up the Sinai. So the Egyptians not only can assert a little bit of pressure, a carrot and stick on Gaza. I mean, if Israel and Egypt got together, they could strangle Gaza. They really wanted to strangle it. They would cut off everything. That hasn't happened. Okay, but that could happen. Okay, I hope it never does, but that would be a possibility. So Egypt is an intermediary. Egypt has a historical role in that region. And the Egyptian government is always worried that Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood will ally against the military government. So actually, Egypt also has a political and military reason to make sure Hamas does not become too powerful. The current government, remember, overthrew the democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood government and put the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in jail. These are, let's not mince words. This is a military dictatorship in Egypt. And they remember that Anwar Sadat was not killed by an Israeli. Anwar Sadat was killed by a fundamentalist. So Sadat is always at the shoulder of Egyptian military leaders who are not Islamicist enough. So there's a lot of reasons for Egypt to be a major player.
Yeah, okay. So that's, again, a background that I wasn't really familiar with. And I guess growing up in Hawaii, as I did,
Right.
You don't necessarily learn these things. But when all of this happens and the media is playing it 24/7, you want to know. I want to know.
I appreciate that.
Now, and social media recently has been throwing around the term anti-Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
What's that about? What's the history of that? And is that something to be concerned about?
Well, I think it's something to, I don't know about be concerned, but to try to understand why it's being used. And it has a couple of different meanings. It just in a neutral way, anti-Zionism is against a Jewish nationalist movement. Just like you would say, anti-Irish, or if you had a certain nationalist movement. Zionism is the historical nationalist movement for Jews. So just in a neutral way. And because it's in a neutral way, there are also Jews who are anti-Zionists. There are Jews who don't believe in a Jewish state. And there are Jews who don't believe there should be a Jewish state until the Messiah comes. Remember, Jews don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. The name is Mashiach. And I know a lot of people think my 19-year-old son is the Mashiach, but that's a different issue. So when the Mashiach comes, then we can have Israel. So they're even, if your audience ever has a free couple of minutes, they'll see funny things like Orthodox Israeli rabbis meeting in Iran at an anti-Israel meeting.
Wow.
And people, okay, but it makes sense because to them, Israel should not exist until the Messiah has returned. Okay, so that's one kind of neutral view. And neutral, I just mean you can see it parsed very clearly. You're either for or against a Jewish nationalist movement. Okay, and so you could see around the turn of the century, there were Jewish socialists who opposed it, right? Because they were internationalists. They didn't even believe in nations. Okay, that's kind of the let's have a cup of coffee, let's be polite to each other discussion. The current use is more controversial. And it's used by people who want to say that we oppose Israel being a Jewish state, but we are not anti Semitic.
Mm.
So they're claiming, we love Jews, we like Jews, etc. We're not against Judaism, but we're against the Jewish state. Now, again, because we're just having a conversation, right? And nobody's trying to make any gotcha points. Sometimes that's very true. I've certainly met and read people who maybe oppose what the Israeli government is doing or don't like the idea of an ethnic state. Okay. And so they oppose Zionism, but they're not going to say Jews need to leave or there shouldn't be a Jewish society. There just should not be a state. And I think we can have a reasonable discussion about that, right? I mean, ethnic nationalism has never ended up in a very good position for anybody. But there are also a lot of people out there. I know a lot is not a very scientific term, but let's say there's a significant number of people out there who are using this as a cover, who really are anti-Semitic or are treating Israel the way that anti-Semitic propaganda has treated Jews for 2,000 years. And they're trying to say, well, I like Jews. Remember the old saying, some of my best friends are black, Strom Thurmond and Wallace's famous saying, okay, but they really are anti-Semites. I mean, when you start saying the Israelis, for example, are stealing organs or taking blood from Palestinians, okay, that's not anti-Zionist. That's anti-Semitic. That's the 1,500-year-old blood libel that Jews used Christian kids' bloods for matzah. I mean, that's just, and that is not tolerable. The other is an interesting discussion, but the cover is not tolerable.
You've actually taught me a lot things I didn't know, and all these are beginnings of discussions. And I think you could do a semester class on this at least. But we have about a minute left, and as a professor of history, a student of history, is there anything that you can tell us from history that you think would benefit the parties to the current conflict in Israel and Gaza?
Okay, 1 minute, a couple of things. And I don't mean to be snarky so we can carry the conversation on. Faulkner always said some people have too much history and need to leave the past. I think we're dealing with that in the Middle East, which isn't cancel culture. I know there's this phrase going around. It's recognizing the past, appreciating the past, but it's Gladstone told the Irish, you can't be shackled to the past. And I think that's part of the issue here. I fully understand it. Look, this country has people waving Confederate flags. They can't leave the past either, right? So we're not without blame. Secondly, because I know we have to go, when you read materials, when you try to study something, please remember the 3 Ds. Don't demonize. Do not practice a double standard. And do not intentionally delegitimize something. And what's happening right now is those who are supporting Israel without question are demonizing, double standard, delegitimizing the other side. And the other side, those who are extreme in their position, Hamas, the young men in LA who attacked Jews the other day, beat them up on the streets, they're demonizing, delegitimizing, and double standard. I guess double standardizing, to coin a phrase. So that's what I would add as a historian. Okay. Plus, I guess the final answer is nobody knows everything. Okay. And be wary of somebody who comes on your show or any other show and says, I know, listen to me, I know the truth. I would be very wary of that.
Well, Professor Hoffenberg, Peter, thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Of course.
I'm learning a lot. I don't know very much about this, so I appreciate your expertise and your talk. So aloha, thank you very much.
Aloha. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time and the excellent questions. And please let your viewers know they can always contact me. I should say before we go, though, these are my views and not the views of the university. So I don't want to besmirch the university in any way. Okay. I want to give them legal protection. Your viewers can be angry at me, but don't pick on UH. There's enough to pick on UH about, but not this. Okay. Thank you very much. Take care. Aloha.
Aloha.
Be well.